We begin at the end of the 13th century in Western Europe. The Kingdom of France is one of the greatest powers on the continent, benefiting from a favorable climate and the many rivers that irrigate the territory. Agriculture thrives and is able to sustain its 16 million inhabitants. The countryside is largely controlled by nobles, who are vassals of the king. In exchange for their lands, they're required in particular to finance and equip a heavy cavalry, which is one of the most powerful in Europe. Across the English Channel lies the Kingdom of England, with a population of 4 million. The climate here is cooler and wetter, encouraging peasants to focus on livestock farming, especially sheep. As a result, the country is a major producer of wool, which is exported to Flanders, where the textile industry is flourishing. England also trades with Brittany, which supplies it with salt, essential for food preservation. Further south, the king has controlled the Duchy of Guyenne for 150 years, where a favorable climate supports vineyards that supply London with wine. But this territory has long been a source of tension between England and France, which seeks to reclaim it. To avoid war, the King of England officially holds the status of Duke of Guyenne, meaning he is a vassal of the King of France and must pay homage to him by kneeling before him. In return, the King of France holds judicial authority over the territory. In 1294, following clashes between Breton, Basque, and English sailors, the Bretons appealed to the French king, Philip IV, for justice. He summons the Duke of Guyenne, namely the King of England, Edward I, before his court. But the latter refuses, and Philip IV confiscates Guyenne, triggering a war. But at the same time, England is already engaged in Scotland, which it fails to subdue and which forms an alliance with France. Meanwhile, France faces difficulties in Flanders, whose economic interests are closely tied to England. In Rome, the Pope eventually secures peace between the two Catholic powers and encourages dynastic marriages to ease tensions. In 1308, the King of England, Edward II, marries the French Princess Isabella, who is only 12 years old. She moves to England, where the war with Scotland continues. In 1324, after a border dispute in Guyenne, a new war breaks out between France and England. In response, Edward II seizes the properties of French subjects living in England, including that of his own wife, Isabella. He then sends her to Paris to negotiate peace with her brother, King Charles IV. The latter agrees to restore Guyenne on the condition that Edward II come and pay homage. Refusing to humiliate himself, Edward II transfers the duchy to his young son, Edward of Windsor, and sends him to Paris to pay homage to his uncle. Peace is restored, but instead of returning to England, Isabella remains in France with her son and begins preparing the downfall of Edward II. A small army of mercenaries lands in England and, facing little resistance, enters London. Edward II flees, but he is eventually captured, and in 1327, his son Edward III becomes King of England. In France, after the death of Charles IV, there is no longer a direct male heir. Isabella is excluded from the succession in favor of her cousin Philip VI of Valois. Edward III pays homage to him, but in an ambiguous manner, without fully recognizing his authority, and then focuses his efforts on Scotland. But France sends military support to its ally, and tensions rise again. Edward III then restricts wool exports to Flanders in order to put pressure on Philip VI, who responds by confiscating Guyenne. This time, Edward III reacts by claiming the French throne as a direct descendant of Philip IV. These events mark the beginning of what is now known as the 100 Years' War. Edward III lands in Antwerp with an army, and after recruiting Allied forces, moves south. The powerful French cavalry force moves to confront him, and on the battlefield faces the formidable English archers. But neither side takes the initiative and both withdraw without fighting. At sea, France initially has the advantage, notably thanks to its Genoese allies. English ports are regularly attacked and ships are captured. In Flanders, the shortage of English wool leads to unemployment among artisans. They revolt against the pro-French count and join Edward III, who they recognize as the King of France. France then assembles a large fleet along the Flemish coast, both to block trade and to prepare for a military invasion of England. But on June 24, 1340, an English fleet attacks and, taking advantage of favorable winds, nearly destroys the French fleet. The English now have control of the seas, securing trade routes and preventing a French invasion. In Guyenne, the war continues, and the English successfully defend Guyenne, which is besieged by a large French army. Rather than confront the powerful French cavalry in open battle, Edward III chooses to land in the Cotentin Peninsula and launches a Chevauchée, meaning a destructive raid across the French countryside. The goal is to finance the campaign through plunder, while diverting French forces from the south. For a month and a half, he devastates towns and villages, massacring populations and looting wealth while avoiding confrontation with the army of Philip VI, who tries to intercept him. After days of pursuit, Edward realizes battle is inevitable. Taking advantage of his advance, he selects favorable terrain, positioning his archers on higher ground and digging pits to disorganize the French cavalry. The following day, the French arrive and attack hastily in a disorganized battle. The English and Welsh archers destroy the French cavalry, and Philip VI returns to Paris without an army. For his part, Edward III proceeds to besiege Calais. After a year without being attacked, he captures the city and its port, which becomes a key gateway for wool trade to Flanders. A truce is then signed, and Edward III withdraws. But at the same time, the Black Death arrives in Marseille and quickly spreads through France and England, ravaging populations and forcing a pause in the war. In 1350, John II becomes King of France. However, he is immediately challenged by Charles II of Navarre, another direct descendant of Philip IV. John II attempts to reduce Charles's influence and sideline him, but fails. In response, Charles II, who controls part of Normandy, allies himself with Edward III, who sends his son Edward of Woodstock, known as the Black Prince, to Guyenne to organize Chevauchée. The objective is once again to destroy and plunder the countryside while avoiding pitched battles. From Bordeaux, he moves up the Garonne to Toulouse, then turns towards Carcassonne, devastating everything in his path. He then returns to Bordeaux, laden with wealth and prisoners, without ever being challenged. The following year, John II has Charles II arrested for treason. The Black Prince then begins a second Chevauchée heading towards central France. This time, the French army manages to intercept him, and a major battle takes place near Poitiers. Once again, English archers destroy the French cavalry, and this time, King John II is captured. His son Charles then takes control of the kingdom in a highly unstable context. On one hand, mercenaries who had been employed in the wars, now without work, regroup into bands known as the Great Companies and begin plundering the countryside. On the other hand, Charles II of Navarre escapes from prison and, taking advantage of his popularity, raises a significant army in Normandy. Meanwhile, in London, Edward III demands 4 million gold écus and half of the French territory in exchange for the release of John II. This request triggers a revolt among Parisian merchants who fear having to pay for the ransom through new taxes. Charles has to leave the capital, while in the north, peasants rise up in turn, violently attacking the nobility. Charles Charles II brutally suppresses this revolt, then enters Paris accompanied by English troops. The Parisians turn against him, ultimately allowing the regent to regain control of the capital. Facing a difficult situation, the regent Charles has no choice but to refuse Edward III's terms. The latter then launches a new chevauchée, this time with the aim of annihilating the French army and being crowned King of France in the Cathedral of Reims, where French kings are traditionally crowned. He lands at Calais and heads toward the city. But on the other side, Charles clearly understands the situation and this time avoids a pitched battle at all costs. He harasses the English vanguard and rearguard and orders the people of the countryside to take refuge inside fortified towns with their food and belongings. As a result, Edward III crosses empty lands and reaches Reims without a fight. He begins the siege of the city, but soon finds himself running out of supplies. He is then forced to abandon his plan and wanders through Burgundy in search of food. In March 1360, he learns that a French fleet has destroyed the coastal town of Winchelsea. Furious, he now heads towards Paris in order to force Charles into a pitched battle. But in the capital, the population and the French army are sheltered behind closed walls. Edward III does not get his battle and, completely out of supplies, urgently sets out. On the night of Easter Monday, while camped in a field not far from Chartres, a huge storm breaks out. Very large hailstones fall and, according to some sources, kill around 1,000 men and 6,000 horses. Terrified by this apocalyptic scene, Edward III is said to have seen it as a divine punishment and to have promised God that he would make peace. The next day, negotiations begin, leading on May 8, 1360, to the Treaty of Bretigny. France cedes a quarter of its territories and must pay 3 million gold écus. In exchange, King John II is released, and Edward III officially renounces the throne of France. In France, John II and his son try to regain control of the country, which is still being ravaged by the great companies. They restore the country's finances, creating the franc in order to pay part of the ransom to the English. In England, Edward III bans the French language, which was still used in courts and tribunals. In 1364, John II dies, and his son Charles V becomes king. He continues with the reforms and completely reorganizes the army, reducing the influence of the nobles in favor of a centralized force under his control. He hires permanent soldiers and places them under the command of experienced captains. But in Burgundy and in the Rhone Valley, he fails to put an end to the great companies, which continue to extort villages and prey on travelers along the roads, including around Avignon, where Pope Urban V resides. Charles V then proposes to the Pope to employ the great companies, officially to launch a crusade against Granada in the Iberian Peninsula, but unofficially to intervene in a civil war in Castile alongside Henry of Trastamara, who is fighting his half-brother King Peter I, known as the Cruel. Charles V thus gets rid of the great companies at the Pope's expense while supporting an ally. His plan works, and Henry drives out Peter I, who takes refuge in Bordeaux to ask the Black Prince and Charles II of Navarre for help. They agree and set out to reconquer Castile. Charles V then sends new reinforcements to Henry, who prevails once again, assassinates Peter I, and becomes King of Castile, allied with France. In Guyenne, the Black Prince has received no financial compensation for his campaign in Castile. He therefore raises taxes to restore his finances. Many cities oppose this and ask Charles V for help. The latter then relies on Bertrand du Guesclin, an experienced commander, to reconquer the territories ceded to the English. His strategy of attrition proves effective, and the towns fall one by one, some rallying to the French side of their own accord. In London, Edward III, seeing that the clauses of the Treaty of Bretigny are not being respected, resumes the offensive. But not having the financial means to attack France directly, he organizes new chevauchées that are meant to pay for themselves. However, these are again undermined by the scorched earth strategy. In 1372, a powerful Castilian fleet arrives at La Rochelle and destroys the English fleet stationed there. Furious, Edward III gives a large army to his son John of Gaunt so that he can carry out the longest and most destructive chevauchée possible. It leaves from Calais and ravages everything across a width of 20 kilometers. The French armies move ahead of them, emptying the countryside, destroying bridges, and harassing isolated English troops. Winter falls, and once again, the English find themselves short of food. They eventually manage to reach Bordeaux, exhausted and having lost many men and horses. In 1377, Edward III dies at the age of 64. England now controls only a few towns in France, while the economic situation is catastrophic, leading to major peasant revolts that tear the country apart. In 1380, Charles V dies and is replaced by his son Charles VI, but being only 12 years old, he falls under the regency of his uncles. At the age of 20, he takes the reins of the country and attempts to subdue Brittany, which resists him. But during the expedition, he's struck by a fit of madness and kills 4 of his own men. Deemed unfit to rule, his wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, presides over a regency council made up of Charles VI's brother, Louis of Orléans, and their uncle Louis of Anjou, John of Berry, and Philip the Bold. The latter, who is Duke of Burgundy and Count of Flanders, becomes increasingly influential. He favors appeasement with England in order to secure trade in Flanders and tries to establish territorial continuity between his lands. At his death, his son John the Fearless takes over, but he's quickly pushed aside by his cousin and rival, Louis of Orléans. In response, John the Fearless, who is very popular in Paris, has him assassinated, triggering a civil war between the Burgundian camp and the one known as the Armagnacs. In England, the new King Henry V, a direct descendant of Edward III, takes advantage of the instability to claim the throne of France. In 1415, he lands in Normandy, not for a chevauchée, but for a campaign of conquest. A French army, mainly composed of Armagnacs, tries to drive him back, but on the battlefield, despite their numerical superiority, they are severely defeated. Henry V's army, weakened by disease, returns to England and comes back 2 years later to conquer Normandy. This time, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians are too busy fighting each other to intervene. But after the fall of Normandy, and while the English are threatening Paris, John the Fearless and Charles, the heir to the throne who's now leading the Armagnacs, agree to meet on a bridge in order to unite against the English. But John the Fearless is assassinated there. Philip the Good, the son of John the Fearless, then chooses to ally himself with the English against the Armagnacs with the support of Charles VI, known as the Mad, and Isabeau of Bavaria. At Troyes, a treaty is signed to disinherit Charles from the throne in favor of Henry V, who marries the Princess Catherine. She then becomes Queen of England, while Henry V is now the heir and regent to the throne of France. He enters Paris alongside Charles VI, to the cheers of the crowds who are exhausted by years of war. On the other side, Charles, isolated, denounces this treaty. In 1422, Henry V and then Charles VI died 2 months apart. Henry VI, the son of Henry V and Catherine, only 11 months old, is proclaimed King of France and England. But in the south, the disinherited Charles also proclaims himself King of France, and the war continues. continues. In 1428, the English begin the Siege of Orleans. It is then that a peasant girl named Joan of Arc appears. She says she hears voices telling her to free France and place the heir Charles on the throne. She obtains from him the right to take part in the defense of Orleans. There, she galvanizes the troops who, in only 10 days, lift the siege. The following month, the Armagnacs take Reims, allowing the coronation of Charles VII. Joan of Arc then convinces him to besiege Paris, but the expedition fails. Joan of Arc is eventually captured by the Burgundians, who sell her to the English. After a long trial, she is burned alive at the stake in Rouen. The English, sensing the tide turning, then crown Henry VI, now 10 years old, in haste in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. In 1435, the Burgundians and the Armagnacs put an end to the Civil War. Charles VII then enters Paris, and the French army gains the upper hand again. But weakened by the many years of war, both sides sign a truce that lasts 5 years. The French then resume the offensive, integrating into their army a brand new light artillery that allows them to dominate the English archers. In 2 years, Normandy and then Guyenne are taken. But in Bordeaux, the population revolts, supporting England, with which it trades. English troops land as reinforcements, and an Anglo-Gascon army goes to meet the French army, but it is severely defeated by artillery. In 1453, England is finally forced to cede Guyenne to France. The country now controls only Calais, and the front stabilizes, marking the unofficial end of the 100 Years' War. No treaty is signed, but after 116 years and many truces, the conflict is effectively over. This war, and especially the Black Death, have had a major impact on the people of both kingdoms. France and England have lost around 40% of their population and will need 2 more centuries to recover their pre-war demographics. The economies of both kingdoms are weakened. In France, the countryside has been heavily affected, with part of the population now living in fortified towns. The nobles have lost prestige and power to the benefit of the monarchy, which now controls a centralized, permanent, and professional army. The war has strengthened the unity of the country, while the many Chevauchée have fueled anti-English sentiment. In England, after the failure in France, Henry VI, who, like his grandfather, suffers from bouts of madness, is undermined by a long civil war that tears the country apart. In the 1470s, England attempts a new incursion into France, but without success. This time, a peace treaty is signed, and the King of England renounces the French crown.